Hey guys, Zombie Survival Guy here, and this is the first episode in an ongoing series. I'm thinking about calling it David and the Murder Machines. And so the idea here is we're going to come in and take a look at some of these firearms, and we're going to look at some of our laws, and we're going to see, what's reasonable. I'm wanting to do this series not so much to beat down on anybody who is against owning firearms or doesn't support the Second Amendment. I can understand that this is one of those situations that people have very strong feelings about, but I figured that we could all have an adult discussion here and take a look and see how the reality of the situation is. Anytime there's one of these attacks or assaults, it is an attack or an assault on all of us, not just the victims. It's an attack on our way of life, on the way we perceive our nation and the people that make it up. And I think it's important to have these discussions. Is what we're doing right? My point of view is that the Second Amendment is sacred, and that it's something that needs to be protected as well. There's a lot of facets that go into these sort of events, but what I want to do with this series is talk about the weapons, because that's what they are. They're weapons, and talk about some of the laws and some of the situations, and kind of give people some information and understanding, because a lot of what I see on the internet, in the chat forums, on Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, and on the news is people talking about these things that seem to not have a total grasp of what these weapons are capable of, what their practical uses are, and they don't have a holistic understanding of these things. The AR-15 has been around for 58 years in one form or another. That's older than me. I think that's older than it's almost as old as my dad. So it's been around for a long time. It's a well-tested weapon system. And we're going to go try to buy one today and see how that goes. Hey, Zombie Survival Guy here in my mobile studio. I'm just at the DMV getting my driver's license updated so that it has my current address on it. I figured today we would try to go and pick up an AR-15 and see just how difficult that is. So, first thing I'll tell you is I actually tried to do this on Tuesday, and I couldn't because my address did not match my driver's license. So had to come by the DMV and get a new driver's license. So we're gonna see how that works out. So got a new driver's license, and we're headed over to the gun store to pick up an AR-15. Maybe. We'll see if all my paperwork's in order. Alright, so I'm back. Went to the gun store, and we got an AR-15. That's it, right there. That is all that constitutes an AR-15 as far as the law is concerned. The barrel, the trigger, the magazine, the buttstock, the trigger guard, everything that goes inside of this is not considered a legally part of the gun as far as licensing goes. This has a serial number and manufacturer's information, as well as a few other labels as far as who made it and such. But that's it. That is all that legally constitutes an AR-15 right there. So went out and picked this guy up, and over the next couple of months I'm gonna put together a full rifle, and we'll kind of go along with that and talk about things as we go. So as far as the experience of actually paying for the rifle, there are two things that made the process that I went through very quick. One, I have an up-to-date driver's license, and two, I have a state concealed carry permit, which basically means that I've already gone through a background check and they've already reviewed to ensure that I don't have a criminal past or any medical history that would bar me from being able to possess a firearm. Probably also helped that the place I purchased this from is a gun range that I frequent fairly regularly, so that people are familiar with me there. To talk about the actual paperwork, the firearm transaction record that you fill out is a 2-page, 3-page form. As the person buying the weapon, you actually only fill out the first page and then you sign the back of that page. And so here's the questions you have to go through to purchase a firearm, at least in the state of Georgia. Other states may have a little bit different of paperwork, but this is just the ATFE's standard form. Last name, first name, middle name, any suffixes, your current street address in full, and it has to match the street address on your driver's license. Your city and state of birth, or if you were born in a foreign country, you need to be able to tell them where that was. Your height, your weight, your sex, I guess your gender. There's only male and female on this, so I guess if you swing a different way, then you just have to scratch it out and write something in. Date of birth, ethnicity. You have to say whether you're Hispanic or not, and then you have to list your race, whether you're American Indian, African American, white, Asian, Pacific Islander, and then we go down into more detailed questions. So, first question, are you the actual transferee / buyer of the firearm listed on this form? Warning, you are not the actual transferee buyer if you are acquiring the firearm on behalf of another person. If you are not the actual transferee buyer, the licensee cannot transfer the firearm to you. The exception to this is if you are picking up a repaired firearm for another person, you are not required to answer 11A and may proceed to 11B, etc., etc. Basically, this is the straw man purchase clause, and this is supposed to prevent people from purchasing a firearm and then giving it to somebody else, or buying it for somebody else and then having them pay them immediately to cover the cost of the gun. For example, if I was to buy this for somebody out in the parking lot and then give it to them for the amount I purchased it for, that's a straw man purchase. That's a crime. And it's a double down crime if I fill this form out saying that that's not what I'm doing and that's totally what I'm doing. So next question, are you under indictment or information in any court for a felony or any other crime for which the judge could imprison you for more than 1 year? So if you're a felon or you're being convicted in a felony case, you can't buy a firearm. Have you ever been convicted of any court of a felony or any other crime for which the judge could have imprisoned you for more than 1 year? Are you a fugitive from justice? Are you an unlawful user of or addicted to marijuana or any depressants, stimulants, narcotic drugs, or any other controlled substance? Warning: the use or possession of marijuana remains unlawful under federal law regardless of whether it has been legalized or decriminalized for medicinal or recreational purchases in the state where you reside. So, that means if you're in California, where it's now legal to possess and consume marijuana, at the state level, you are still committing a federal crime and a federal felony by possessing or using marijuana. And if you are doing that, if you are enjoying recreational marijuana in a state where that's legal, you are still committing a federal crime and are not allowed to own or purchase a firearm. Have you ever been educated as a mental defective, or have you ever been committed to a mental institution? Mental defective is, a broad range legal term that basically just means you are not capable of making rational, reasonable decisions and are legally not allowed to purchase a firearm based on your mental status. Have you been discharged from the armed forces under dishonorable conditions? Basically, a dishonorable discharge usually involves a felony action for which you would also be kicked out of the military. So it's sort of a double dip. You've committed a felony, but you are also kicked out of the military because of that felony and probably served time in a military prison. So basically, this is just saying, did you commit a felony while you were in the military? Are you subject to a court order restraining you from harassing, stalking, or threatening your child or an intimate partner or child of such partner? So this covers spousal abuse. If you've got a restraining order, then there are limitations. I don't think this one specifically excludes you from being able to own a firearm, but there's severe limitations, and I think you have to have been found no longer dangerous or something. There's limitations to this one, but it's basically a way to say that if you're dangerous to a child or its mother, or you've been given a restraining order, you can't purchase a firearm. Have you ever been convicted in any court of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence? If you've been convicted of domestic violence, can't own a gun. Country of citizenship. Were you born in the United States? Are you a citizen of the United States, or are you a citizen of another country? Interestingly enough, being the citizen of another country doesn't necessarily mean that you can't own a firearm. Have you ever renounced your United States citizenship? Are you an alien illegally or unlawfully in the United States? Are you an alien who has been admitted to the United States under a non-immigrant visa? If yes, do you fall within any of the exceptions stated in the instructions? And if you are an alien, record your U.S. issued alien or administration number on the following line. So basically, being an alien resident of the United States or being a non-citizen doesn't necessarily negate your right to own a firearm while you're within the borders of the United States. Being here legally, I think, does limit that for sure, but being a non-citizen doesn't negate your right to self-defense as far as the United States government's concerned. I know there's limitations on it, but it doesn't necessarily negate it. And following that, you sign and date that you have answered all of these questions honestly, and that if you have not, you will be breaking federal law. Going down below that, there's a long form where the seller fills out what type of firearm they're selling, type of firearm to be transferred, handgun, long gun, or other. For example, flamethrower or receiver. And that's what we bought. We bought a lower receiver, so not a whole gun. falls into the special category. If transfer is at a qualifying gun show or event, name of the function, city and state. So that portion covers, there's areas to fill out information if you're at a gun show doing this transfer. Then there's a lot of stuff about the identification of the business making the transfer or the licensed seller making the transfer. And then the information is put into a computer or transferred. Used to be by fax machine, but I think just about all of it's done by computer now. And they send it into NICS, and it gets processed. And then once the process results, which doesn't take very long, it takes less than 5 minutes typically, they would either be allowed to proceed, denied, canceled, or delayed. Delay means something came up that was flagged, or maybe the person just moved and the information's not quite correct, but it will be, or there's some other mitigating circumstance. Canceled means that the data went through, but it was just rejected as not some part of the paperwork wasn't correct. Denied means there's a reason this person cannot have a gun. It doesn't necessarily say why they can't have the gun. It just says they can't have the gun. And proceed means they're allowed to follow through with the sale. And then there's a lot of other paperwork for the seller to fill out. And then the seller more or less has to keep this piece of paperwork on file forever, just in case at a later date something comes up and they need to be able to pull this data and get information about the person. Likewise, they also make a photocopy of your driver's license and your concealed carry permit, and that's pretty much all the paperwork. After that, it's using cash or credit card or some other means of paying for the purchase, and in my case, you're good to go. If you have a delay or you're within a state that has a waiting period, then at that point, that waiting period would start, or you would have to wait for the delay to clear. So that covers the big part of the actual process. In total, this took about 30 minutes. And was not, not very complicated, not a lot of hoops to go through. But then again, I'm already in the system, my information's already been checked, so it's going to be a little faster for me than somebody who's just making their first purchase, or might have some other mitigating circumstances. And it's not that everybody just gets approved or run through the system. While I was waiting to make my purchase, there were a couple of people in the store as well who their sales were delayed because of paperwork or address changes, things of that nature, and they had to put aside the sale, put aside the purchase, and come back another day once everything was figured out. There was another person who had to be put on a delay, so they were able to purchase the weapon, but they were not able to take hold of it that day because there was a waiting period. And that covers the big part of the sale. If you have any questions, feel free to post them below, and I'll try to get back with that. I think we'll go into a little bit more about, exactly what this is and what it's capable of once we have a few more parts to it, so it looks a little bit more substantial. Right now, that's kind of vague. You can't really imagine that doing much of anything to anything. It's just a piece of empty metal. So I'm going to wrap up this portion, and I'm going to review my other cuts, and we'll see if we can't splice this into something that makes sense to anybody. Alright, thanks everybody. Alright, so just a few final thoughts and caveats before I wrap up this first video in this series. So, I went out and I bought the receiver for the AR-15 today. But there's some things to consider before you look into purchasing a firearm like that. One is you should really seek out some training, get a little bit of experience with the weapon before you decide to purchase one. And a lot of rifle ranges will have AR-15s or similar weapons available for rent so that you can actually try them out before you choose to purchase one, whether that's a full build or a do-it-yourself, kind of like what we're doing here. It's good to kind of get an idea about what you're purchasing and what you might want to actually be using it for. Also, if you've never used a weapon before, taking a class for gun safety and rifle safety would probably be useful. Some other things to consider, if you don't feel like a firearm's right for you, or even if you do, you should definitely consider getting a first aid kit, some sort of trauma kit that you can keep with you, keep in your car. That way, if there is an emergency or something bad happens, or worst case scenario, you actually have to use that weapon, then you have something to treat the injury afterwards. Because I don't think anybody really wants to take a life if they're a responsible person, but sometimes you have to do something to protect yourself. But once the danger's over, it's all about saving lives, whether that's the bad guy, good guys, innocent people. It's good to have a first aid kit, trauma kit, something to ensure that you can undo some of the damage that's been done by these weapons. Another thing to consider before you make a purchase of a large firearm is having some way of securing that, whether it's a gun lock or a trigger lock or something like what I've got here, which is a big old gun safe, which ensures that the weapons are secure and out of the reach of children or anybody else who may want to get a hold of them or might not know what they're doing with them. It's just a good idea. I don't have kids right now, so I'm not so concerned about a child coming in and getting a weapon, but I do think about what if somebody broke into my home. I wouldn't want them to have access to a deadly weapon just because I left it laying out for somebody to pick up. And so those are just some final thoughts on things to consider. You want to have some way of securing your weapon. You want to have some way of undoing damage, first aid kit, first aid training, CPR training, something like that. And you wanna get a little experience and a little bit of information before you choose to make a firearms purchase. Because a weapon like an AR-15 isn't right for everybody. There's another type of weapon that might be better suited for your situation. It may be a snub-nosed .38. It may be a self-defense shotgun. Those are things to consider. And then, of course, there's people who, don't believe that a weapon's necessary for personal safety, and that's a completely respectable choice. But if that's the case, definitely think about your plan for what you're going to do if a bad situation does occur, and think about what your skills can do to help people. Because not everybody's suited for fighting back. Not everybody's suited to be a warrior, and a lot of the people who act like they aren't. So it's worth keeping in mind that there's a need to be that person that shoots the video of the tragedy. There's a need to be that person who renders first aid, who grabs somebody and drags them to safety, who calls for help. All these people are necessary. We're a very violent culture. We're very warrior-esque in a lot of ways. Even when we talk about being peaceful, we do it in a very warlike fashion. So it's worth keeping in mind that there's more aspects to these tragedies than just the weapons. There's how to render aid, how to get help where it's needed, how to keep track of what's happening and document it so that people can look at it later on and figure out exactly what occurred and what they can do to keep it from happening again. And like I see, these are just some final thoughts. We're going to pick this up with some other stuff in another video next week or the week after. I appreciate y'all hanging in with me for all my ramblings today. Peace out, and once again, thanks for viewing. Adios.